Hey, I'm Joe with JRed Studios, and in this video, I'm going to make my version of an expensive furniture store's media console for about $200, while also trying to work with a new wood species. So I've been redoing my living room and making it a lot more homey lately, and it's finally time to make a new TV stand that kind of fit in and give us some more storage. So I went online to see what options were out there and start feeling what kind of style I was going for. Well, after looking through multiple places, I never really found one that I loved. They all had some things that I liked, but none of them went with the feeling I was after. And don't get me started about what they were asking for all that particle board. So I just decided to take some of the elements that I liked and leave out all the rest. But now that I think about it, that's kind of what got me started with woodworking to begin with. I needed something to fit a specific size and purpose, but I could never find a good fit I could actually afford. I had a good understanding of some basic tools and had some pretty solid DIY home projects under my belt, so I figured I would give it a go and just try and make exactly what I wanted. Now, I'm not saying it came out perfect. Actually, it was far from it. But the feeling of pride when I was done was worth all the hours just by itself. For this build, I'm going to be using about 2 full sheets of 3/4 inch birch ply I got from the big box store. Now, it wasn't my first choice of material, but it was one of those deals I just really couldn't pass up. I went to the store a few months back to get a dowel and a pack of screws, and saw a cart with the ply on it marked down from $90 to $20. So, naturally, I bought 5 sheets. Now here we are, ready to start using some of them up. To make it easy on myself, I'm going to break them down to manageable pieces with the track saw before setting them through the table saw. Doing it this way just allows me to get more accurate cuts and not have to struggle to push 4x8 sheets through the table saw. Now this is going to be a pretty large piece, roughly 80 by 20 by 32, which unbeknownst to me is going to make things a lot more difficult down the line, but we're not there yet. Alright, here's a tip you may not know. An easy way to measure the inside distance of a miter is to clamp a square reference to that inside edge and then use it to hook your tape measure to get an accurate read. I typically check 2 to 3 spots just to be sure, but the result is a perfect fit with little effort. For the design of this piece, I didn't want the attention to go to the box itself, so I'm just building this box as simple as I can, and I'm going to paint it a dark color towards the end. The doors will kind of be the star of the piece, bringing some nice warm wood tones to the room, which is really what I'm counting on with this new wood species. Alright, so now that the outside of the box exists, we can turn our attention to the divider and the shelves. I took the inside measurement we just took and subtracted the thickness of my material and divided that by 2. That's going to give me the size of both openings and where to place that center divider. To secure it in place, I just cut in a few dominoes. This also works with biscuits or even pocket holes, since ultimately this is going to be painted and none of them are ever going to be seen. Now the rest of the box construction will all be sized relative to itself. It's going to give me more accurate results and account for any errors I may have made along the way. Now, like I said earlier, making a box this size revealed the reason I think this plywood is marked down so much. It's not even close to flat. It looks flat, and it'll lay flat as a whole sheet, but that's about it. These long spans really highlighted it and had me questioning my sanity as I would check for square, thinking I really messed up. There were some spots the dip would even get as bad as 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. But as I continued to add support to the box with the divider and all the shelves, it mostly worked itself out, but it was definitely throwing me off. So I plan on using these other 3 sheets that I got for shop projects instead of furniture. With all the dominoes cut, the last thing I wanted to do before gluing up the cabinet was just to add some hardwood edge banding. For this, I picked up a board of 4/4 maple from the local lumber yard. To size the edge banding, I just used a piece of the plywood to set the fence and added about a 1/16 or so just to be able to plane it back flush later. To make things easier gluing up the edge banding, I went ahead and clamped the pieces flat to my bench and cut in some biscuits to keep everything aligned during the process. Now if you don't have a biscuit joiner, don't worry, this would also work with the domino. Now you may have noticed I also decided to make the edge banding pretty thick. That was just with the hopes that it's going to help tame this wonky plywood, or at least the front edge when we go to hang the doors later, so everything lines up. With all the edge banding glued on and added clamps, all I had to do was trim off the excess. I did this with a combination of the track saw and a flush trim pole saw, mainly just to speed things along. This all could be done with the pole saw. The last thing before glue up is just to flush up the edge banding, and my 4.5 smoothing plane made quick and very satisfying work of this task. If you don't own a smoothing plane, I highly recommend it. It accomplishes a task like this with very little effort. You don't really have a risk of burning through the veneer with a sander, and it's just fun. Now we're ready to glue this bad boy up. I decided to go ahead and do it in one go, which is probably not my best idea, but I had assembled and disassembled this piece so many times at this point, I figured I could do it. But to take a little pressure off, I decided to use some Titebond 2 Extend, which has a longer open time, with the trade-off of just being super runny, so a little more cleanup along the way. Luckily, everything came together. I just had to bust out all the big boy clamps to get this one done. Next on the to-do list, I need to apply some edge banding to the back of the case. This edge banding is only about 1/8 of an inch thick versus the front of the case. I could have done this when I did the front, but I wanted to keep things moving since these pieces were just too wide for most of the clamps I have, and I pretty much had to do the edge banding one glue up at a time. So, a quick miter with a table saw, a little glue, and a couple well-placed brad nails, and we were good to go. With the case out of the way, I'm finally ready to go ahead and start working on the doors. Originally, I was thinking of using some quarter sawn red oak or something along those lines, since it's going to be a continuous grain across the doors, but I wasn't 100% sure that's what I wanted. The price tag for the amount I needed was enough for me to keep exploring my options. This is red elm, which I had never heard of or worked with before, just had a run-in with elm in the past. The guy at the lumberyard was telling me all about this stuff and how it was, quote, a woodworker's dream to work with. So that, paired with the cheap cost per board foot, I decided to give it a go. Now, when I bought all these boards, they were flat and straight. By the time they acclimated and I was ready to use them, they had curved and twisted something fierce. Typically, you just mill it and you're good to go. But this stuff was just under 7/8 of an inch to begin with, so there was only so much skip planing I could do without making them too thin for the hinges. So you pair that with the fact that it was hard on my track saw, burned easily, had a bunch of cracks appear on me, and it smelled like a barn when I was cutting into it, I would say that nightmares are dreams too. To get this stuff to play ball, I used a good bit of dominoes to get it mostly aligned, while also being mindful that I was going to need to cut this panel up into doors, so I was extra careful during the layout to avoid cutting into one. After a lot of trips to and from the joiner off camera, I still ended up having a section that didn't close up in the clamps during the glue up, so to fix it, I just ripped that board off with the track saw and then re-glued it back on the panel. After all the prep work, it's finally time to cut this panel into some doors. For the continuous grain effect to work, I need to cut the doors in order, but also need to make sure the reveals and everything are accounted for when I do this to keep the effect. You really only get one shot at doing this, so it's best to really slow down and take your time. After the first door, I realized I did not have the right hinges, and after a trip to the hardware store, I realized they didn't have them either, which left me only able to hang the first door and be stuck waiting on the right hinges. This took about a little over a week, and when they showed up, the second set of hinges was missing, so I had to deal with that. Another week later, I finally had the hinges to keep moving forward, but in the long run, we got it done. Unfortunately, I forgot to film most of that. While I was waiting for the hardware, I jumped over to the base of the cabinet. For this, I went super simple. I just ripped everything to width with the table saw and then hopped over to the miter saw to cut the 45s. The majority of the base will be built using pocket holes, but to strengthen and align the front of the miters, I'm going to add some internal splines. To keep it simple, I'm just going to make the splines 1/8 of an inch wide, which is the thickness of my blade, and all that edge banding we cut earlier for the back of the cabinet. To ensure a tight but not too tight fit, I just swiped the splines a couple times with a block plane before final glue up. If you're enjoying this video or at least got something useful out of it, I'd love to ask for your subscription. It's a free way to help support me in the channel to keep me making projects just like this. I do all of this in my free time in the evenings and on my day off, so the support means a whole lot. Feel free to comment, like, and share too, but as always, no pressure. Now, here's an issue I'd planned in my head, but I forgot to take care of before I glued up the carcass. I needed a way to help keep the doors flat once they were attached, as this panel is definitely on the temperamental side. I could have easily set the shelves back an inch or so on the inside of the cabinet to allow for calls of some sort to keep the doors in check, but since I forgot to do that along the way, I had to get a little creative. I just made a quick template out of some scrap plywood with notches cut towards the ends so I wouldn't have to try and get the router in the corners. Then using a jigsaw to cut away the bulk of the material, I could come back with the templating bit on the router and follow my template. At some point the bearing got wedged between the bit and the collar of the router, causing it not to work correctly and heat up quite a bit, which left a terrible cut quality with burning, chip out, and ultimately a trashed router bit. But luckily for me, this project is paint grade, so I was able to add some wood filler where it was needed, sand it all down, clean up the edges, and once I get paint on there, you would never know any of it happened unless you watch this video. For the paint, I just used some enamel paint from the big box store. This was my first time using this brand of paint, and overall I think it worked pretty well. It did take 3 solid coats and some touch-ups on the underside where I couldn't really reach it when it was on the bench. The only thing I really would have done differently would be to use a wider roller to help speed things along. Now for the color, I was really wanting some sort of a dark charcoal or earthy tone. It doesn't really look like it in the shop lighting, but once it's in the final destination, I think it's pretty spot on. I don't know what I was more excited for though, to have this project done or just to have my workbenches freed up. This project took so much longer than I intended for, with the complications from the materials and availability of the hardware, but I think in the end it'll all be worth it. You'll just have to wait and see and comment what you think down below. Over at the drill press, I set up a fence and depth stop to countersink and pre-drill all the holes for the door calls. Now that might not be the right term for them, but I'm blanking on what else to call them, so for this video, I'm just going to stick with door calls. Now these are made out of red oak and are about 1 inch thick and 1.5 inches wide. Now they're going to be attached with 4 screws near the edges of the doors where they're most likely to warp. Now I'm not going to glue them in place, and the holes are a touch oversized to allow for some expansion and contraction, but not a ton. Now like I stated in the beginning of this video, I made this whole thing for about $200. I only had about $40 in plywood, $25 in paint, $30 in hinges, and $100 in red elm, and probably about $5 to $10 in shop supplies. The back panel was free from work, and the primer was paid for from another job. Now, if you were to have to buy everything at full price, it would run you closer to about $450 depending on the plywood and lumber, which for a piece of this size is still a steal. For a comparable piece this size, the closest I was able to find was roughly $1,000, give or take. Yes, I had labor involved, but when you have a hobby like woodworking, it can feel like playtime, except for sanding. Nobody likes sanding. When it came to the finish for the doors, all I really knew is that I wanted a warm feel to it. Since I never worked with red elm before and I had 2 different wood tones to blend, I needed to find something to bring them both together. I tried a couple of my go-tos on some of the offcuts, but they really didn't do it. So I went to my second string of finishes, and they didn't do it. So then I decided to go pick up some stain from the hardware store. I grabbed a can of weathered oak, and I gotta say, it did the job the best. Now I haven't used a stain like this since my very first piece, and it was not the most enjoyable process back then, but this elm really took it quite well, just applying it with a rag and then buffing it off with a paper towel. Now with all the finish applied, I could finally set it up and take a couple beauty shots before filling it up with candles and all kinds of other nonsense I had laying around my living room. That's going to be it for this one. Thank you again for watching it and making it all the way to the end. You guys rock. Please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. And until next time, auf Wiedersehen.